Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you on the West Coast. My name is Amy Cameron, and I'll be your host today in this STL Partners webinar, Edge Computing, Clearing the Fog Around Telcos' Role in the Distributed Cloud. So today, our two panelists are Philip Laidler, who's the Director of STL Partners Consulting Practice, and Jonas Strobel, who is a Senior Consultant here at STL Partners. So just a bit of housekeeping before I hand over to them. We are recording this webinar, so we'll be sharing that recording with everybody after it's over. And we can also share the slides in PDF version with everyone. And we'll probably do about a 30-minute presentation with Jonas and Phil, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. So I think that's it from me. And without further ado, I will hand over to Phil and Jonas.
Thank you very much, Amy. This is Phil Laidler. I head up the consulting practice at STL Partners. First of all, welcome to all of you joining. Great to have you here. What I'd like to do is just set a little bit of the scene for today. What we're going to do is we're going to take you through some of the work we've been doing, and you'll find some of what we're going to show you in reports. One we published recently was sponsored by HPE and Intel, and that's the one sort of in the middle there called Edge Computing 5 Viable Telco Business Models. So some of you will have seen that already, and we're going to be showing some of the material from that research as well. There's also another report we're about to release. We're going to publish it in the next couple of weeks. And that's based on some research sponsored by Aricent, and that's really going to go into a little bit more about the practicalities of implementing Edge and the challenges there. So I'd like to first of all say thank you to our sponsors for helping support this research activity that's part of our wider research program. And I'd also like to mention some of the other material we're going to be sharing with you today is material that's come out of insights we've developed through our consulting activity. And we've been working with a number of operators in Europe and in Asia, really trying to help them think through their MEC strategies and their edge compute strategies, and looking at how they need to think about partnering, how they need to identify the use cases and the business models behind those use cases, and really working through some of their requirements. So we're going to draw on the research activities on the left and our consulting activities on the right, and we've got a fairly condensed review, but it's also about hearing from questions from yourselves. So at the end of our presentation, we'll be taking questions, and maybe we'll be able to address any points raised there. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Jonas, who's a senior consultant at STL Partners, and he's going to take us through some of the key insights we've built over the last 6 to 9 months working in edge compute with telcos. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Right, so what I wanted to do first is to set a bit of the context. I mean, the title of today's webinar is really around figuring out what telco's role is in this ecosystem of the distributed cloud, and what telco's role with their edge compute, potential edge compute assets is in that space. And to set this context, I would like to kind of identify a couple of underlying trends and drivers in this wider cloud and IT space, what we're currently seeing. And these drivers, they really push the market more towards a distributed a model really in the cloud space. And one of the key things what we're seeing over the last 1 to 2 years quite a lot is this buzzword around hybrid and multi-cloud. So we see that in the enterprise space, people are using different clouds, public clouds, private clouds, and it's ever more. It's about managing different and more distributed, ever more distributed cloud assets. So this is kind of one driver that we see towards this world of a more distributed compute. Another drive, another trend that we're seeing is around IoT. And that is obviously about devices, that's about all these figures that we hear about with billions of sensors and devices, but this is also about trends that we're seeing around in the space, which relates to the public cloud, to the centralized cloud, where cloud players try to, such as AWS or Azure, where they try to, with edge concepts at, let's say, the gateway level, where they try to kind of get into this edge space and IoT space as well, and by that distributing the cloud and the cloud model more and more. There's another bit more recent trend that we're seeing, which is around in the cloud, basically to say we try to move towards more lightweight compute models. So the traditional deployment model in the cloud that we know obviously is around virtual machines, and what we see over the last few years is trends towards technologies such as containerization, as well as serverless compute model, more or less pioneered by AWS Lambda, but we see other propositions from other players, open source propositions in that space as well. So this is something that we see, and obviously that ties in with this distributed concept, because you want to have more lightweight compute models if you don't have the assets or the resources available from a hyperscale cloud. So that's a quite critical trend in that regard. And basically to tie everything together, there's a trend where we see that cloud deployment models and the way you deploy applications in the cloud, it's more and more about platform agnostic deployment. So I think the key technology I've already mentioned that is around containers. It's about being able to shift around workloads between different clouds, centralized resources, more distributed assets, and that's basically tying all of this a bit together, really. So we see this basically happening, and this is not a telco concept. This is a wider cloud or IT enterprise IT trend. What we're seeing with these 4 drivers here, and the question that we have really, and that's kind of the question for today as well, is can telcos play a stronger role in this space with these trends? We know that telcos have not been very successful with hyperscale cloud propositions. There's just a few who still do this on a larger scale. We know that there's operators who have sold off their assets in that space. So our question is really, with a more distributed model, can telcos use their assets which are distributed with the network, with different types of compute and storage assets that they have across the network? Can they play a stronger role? And I think in that context, just to throw it in the beginning already, is there's obviously an elephant in the room here, which is 5G, and with 5G, what we see is obviously that this is a distributed compute concept as well, and some might say that edge computing is sort of a stepping stone towards 5G to enable these low latency applications, for example. 5G and edge computing as well, they impact each other's business case. And some might also say, people who say, okay, we're doing 5G anyway at some point. Obviously, it's kind of that's kind of a big debate today, or right now, what's the business case for 5G? But if you're saying you're doing this anyway together with SDN and NFV, is there a way to basically piggyback edge compute on your deployment of 5G? So there's interesting relationships between 5G and edge compute in that space. So given this context, what we basically then see is we see that telcos are they find themselves in an existing edge or distributed compute ecosystem. And how that looks like is basically what we see on this next slide. So if you think about more centralized assets like the public cloud towards the decentralized assets with the access networks, as well as, let's say, the customer premise even, we see that traditional hyperscale players like AWS, we think of them as large IaaS and PaaS players. But what we've seen over the last few years is that they've tried to spread out their assets more and more in this more distributed space. So we see AWS is running their own CDN globally with points of presence, for example. They've been gaining a lot of traction around on-premise initiatives like AWS Greengrass and their IoT initiatives as well. They are playing in the hybrid cloud space together with VMware as well since quite recently. So what we see is basically they're trying to span their whole cloud platform across these different more centralized and decentralized parts of the stack, so to say. And we're not only seeing that with AWS, we see that with Microsoft Azure as well, with their partnerships with several CDNs, and also with their IoT initiatives, which are then more on-premise based, with like Azure Stack or Azure IoT Edge. And interestingly, these guys, when they think about these more on-premise related initiatives, they talk about edge computing here. Obviously, this is not edge computing from a telco perspective, but it's part of this overall distributed cloud ecosystem. There's other players as well. So I'm just mentioning one of these more in the industrial automation IoT space with GE, the Predix platform, what they have, centralized resources as well as edge resources, devices, on-premise gateways, and so on. And basically the platform spanning centralized and decentralized. And well, the question now is really how does the telco relate to this? And what we know, obviously, what we see is the telco, they have these telco cloud assets. They're building these up for their own SDN NFV. Some of these might also have hyperscale cloud deployments. Some telcos are running their own CDNs or partnering with CDN providers. Obviously, the core thing is here, telcos' points of presence in the network, aggregation points, exchanges, up to the base station with their mobile access network, as well as assets in the fixed asset access network. And also, some telcos might have managed services on-premise with the enterprise customer. And basically, the telco is also spanning in this picture, is also spanning this overall distributed cloud space. And what we see already now here is that there's a couple of different types of edge computing here emerging. You might think that from a traditional point of view, a CDN is more or less distributed. You wouldn't say that it's exactly edge computing, but it's also distributed asset. Then we see the telco network edge. You might think of MEC in this context, but also other initiatives like CORD, for example, or fog computing at different depths of the network, basically. And also we see edge concepts which we could basically name IoT edge or enterprise edge. The enterprise edge is an interesting example because it might also, if you think about, for example, vCPE products, it might have certain workloads sitting in the network, certain workloads sitting on a box on premise. Same with the IoT edge, where, for example, AWS Greengrass falls under. And you might even think of the device as a sort of edge. If you think about future autonomous cars with lots of compute on board, it's also sort of an edge in this overall space. So the question that we have is now really, if you look at this kind of chart, you see that the telco is sort of filling a gap here with its core and access networks. And the question that we have is, how should the telco, who's, let's say, not been very successful in the centralized cloud game, who's also, if you look at the existing initiatives, not the first in this edge computing space, how should the telco leverage this and leverage these assets? And that's basically something that we wanted to ask you. So we have basically a vote set up. I'm just going to go through this quickly. So our question is, how should telcos leverage their network assets in a distributed cloud market? So this picture that we've just seen, is this for telcos to create a control point to avoid commoditization? So to really say, okay, this is now our, this is not the card we're playing. This is our lever to gain some traction in the market with this. Based on our unsuccessful initiatives in the past around cloud.
Yeah, and I guess if I can just interrupt, I guess the thinking here is, if, as per the previous chart, operators genuinely have a unique asset and its unique asset associated to their services, and this is an opportunity to exploit that to establish some value and yeah, to some extent a control point, and then therefore this time this gives them a lever by which they can avoid the commoditization, and they can create a difference and some differentiation, something unique. That's, I guess, the thinking around pursuing that sort of strategy.
Exactly. So that's the first option that we set out here, and on the other end of the spectrum, we would say that telcos could think of this as an opportunity to become a complementary part of this ecosystem that we've just seen on the previous chart. So telcos would, in that context, telcos would acknowledge an existing situation, and they would say, okay, we try to be complementary with other players and try to tie in with this ecosystem, especially with, obviously we always talk about interoperability between operators, but that would also entail being complementary to the cloud ecosystem and tying in with the cloud ecosystem. Right, so.
Thanks everyone. I've left that open for you for a little while. We'll give you a few more seconds to cast your votes and then present them to Jonas and Phil and see their reactions. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results.
Great. Okay, that's interesting. Those of you should be able to see on your screens, there's about 40% of those on the call. I think it's about just over 50 people on the call. So about 41% of you see this as yes, it's an opportunity to create something distinct, differentiated, avoid commoditization, and about, well, obviously 60% of you see this as being more complementary, and the strategy should be more around fitting into established ecosystems and really supporting and providing them or integrating with them, rather than trying to create a control point, a new point to leverage and create distinct value. And I think it is a tricky one, because on one hand, I think it is true that this is a unique asset, and the access network and the associated facilities that can be used for edge compute are something that others don't have. But on the other hand, we have to recognize the world as it is. And I think the work we've done on this, and talking to operators, but talking also to, I guess, application providers, developers, and other ecosystem partners, in other words, potentially some of the people who might look to use edge compute resource, I think we've come to the view that by all means, try and develop an offering and try and develop something to take to market that's yours and distinctive, but you're not going to create a control point. It's going to be incredibly difficult to do, and you're better off accepting that at least a significant, if not most, of the edge compute that an operator will bring to market will need to do so as part of a complementary, or in a complementary way, to an existing ecosystem. And we've come up with this view for a number of reasons. I think partly because the world is what it is, and there are de facto standards, and there are de facto development platforms, and there are de facto approaches to launching services that are there, and that's the reality. And with all the will in the world, it's going to be very difficult to change that. So you have to work with what there is, and that's where are people going today? Well, they're going to Azure and AWS when it comes to developing and launching applications. So you cannot try and take those on. You have to recognize that they're developing their own ecosystems and try and use those and exploit those and plug into them. So that's one thing. The other thing is, quite brutally, the past experiences that operators don't have, or have not had a great track record in launching particularly developer-centric or application-centric platforms. Now, there are some isolated success stories, and we have documented that in our research in the past, but in general, this isn't something operators are particularly good at. So you're kind of better off working with others who are good at it, and therefore that would tend to suggest that seeing at least a significant part of your future business around a complementary role, wider ecosystems, is important. The third thing is, this is really new space. So yeah, you've got a unique asset by all means, but no one today is building anything to edge because there isn't an edge to build to. So it's not as if you've got a ready queue of application and developers that are just desperate to access this. There's going to have to be a bit of a chicken and egg here. You're going to have to get people figuring out if and how they can make use of this slice of the cloud continuum that up until today just hasn't been there for them to use. So I think you've got to recognize that it isn't that there's a long queue of people urgently seeking to move workloads onto the edge. There are some people who are speculating that it might meet some needs that they've got, but they don't know yet. And that chicken and egg means you've got to find a way of making it really easy for existing operators to engage with it. And the easiest way they can engage to it is through their existing approaches, platforms, and development environments. Finally, we're not saying actually you have to create one way or the other. You have to create your own solution, take it to market, or you have to plug into AWS. We're not saying that. I think be opportunistic. By all means, try several routes to market, but don't be dogmatic, and don't try and take on folks you can't take on. So it's a little bit more about taking an attitude, which is, well, try anything. All routes are good routes, at least initially. Having said all that, you have to think long and hard about your pricing models and the business models, and you have to make sure that your strategy around those does provide a route, does provide a fertile basis for application providers, for developers, for existing applications to get to start exploring and making use of edge compute. And I think that's another key finding is get some of your business model right and get some of your pricing associated with that right. Be prepared to evolve it pretty quickly. Would you add anything, Jonas?
Right, I think it nicely ties into what I wanted to present next, which is given this, what we just discussed, there are several strategies that telcos could take here, being really complementary, but also building their own solutions. And that's really tying in nicely to some other research that we've done, which is really trying to figure out what are these business models. And what we found is that there is in fact a broad menu of options for operators, and options which are very different in terms of the risk profile for these options, as well as the role in the value chain. I just wanted to go through some of these here. The first one is really a very passive business model for telco. So we call this dedicated edge hosting. So what this would be is basically the telco is providing edge bare metal distributed across the network. It's at certain locations. It might just be a metropolitan area. It might be the whole network. But it's only deploying that compute and storage fabric once there is someone who wants to use it. And someone else would then basically, like an IaaS provider who wants to get more into the distributed space, or like a CDN provider who wants to run a virtualized CDN there, would then run their stack on top of that. And the operator would in that case act like a co-location provider. There is obviously some investment that you need to make in terms of some of the orchestration. This needs to be integrated with the network. You need to have the APIs ready for that, because obviously if you have a distributed system here, people want to make use of APIs which are about location, for example. So that's rather kind of a co-location business model. And obviously taking that further, the telco could then say, okay, I want to be more like a cloud player here in an active way. So you would provide a platform which is ready to use for application developers, which is not the case for this very raw dedicated edge hosting, really. And in the second business model around edge IaaS and PaaS, and we also include NAS here because it's with network as a service, you could say that obviously the connectivity would be quite important here as well, and maybe also access to certain network functions. So this is like the telco would have a platform, a portal for developers to develop on. This doesn't mean that the telco is competing head-on with the cloud providers. There are ways to integrate this with the centralized cloud players through APIs, so you can still be complementary with this. And obviously, we acknowledge that this might be a business model which is a bit more risky. Also, you need to probably make more upfront investment here across the network to have a compelling platform which has certain geographic coverage as well.
And I guess just quickly, if I can interject, I mean, the kind of question that relates back to the vote we just did is the policy engine that determines where the workloads resides. Yeah, so that the engine that will say, okay, this workload I want on the edge, this workload I want to put it more centrally, or this workload I want to put on the device, and moving that workload depending on how and when it needs to. I mean, sometimes it will make sense for the operator to provide that, and sometimes it will have to allow for others' policies engines to plug in and make use here. And I think what you need to just understand that and accept that and figure out how are you going to manage that conflict and how are you going to resolve that. But I think it's a mistake to go down a route where you have to choose one or the other.
Right, and obviously these are two more like let's say enabler roles in the value chain, but we also found other possible business models here. One is around obviously systems integration, and I mean what we today already see is lots of proofs of concept, trials where operators work together with, let's say, enterprises or public institutions or whatever in these areas. And well, in that case, in the systems integration business model, you would use edge compute and edge compute resource obviously as a component of an overall project, and you would obviously price that project accordingly in the right way as a systems integration project. We know the telcos are struggling to get the margin also for with SI businesses as well, so and SI projects, but obviously from a risk perspective, this is again something where the telco, let's say the telco is doing an SI project with a large manufacturer, it would then deploy the edge compute resource where it needs that resource for that project, and not having to kind of push a platform and gain traction with a large number of developers, for example. And the last one is then more kind of an end-to-end role for just applications which are edge-enabled. And that could be business applications, let's say applications around IoT, which are edge-enabled. You could think of these use cases around surveillance cameras and these kind of things. Which kind of need some edge compute analytics, and these could also be consumer applications. So you might want to think about augmenting existing consumer content offerings that you might have with a VR offering or AR offering. It could be around gaming, around live sports, and so on. So that's something more of an end-to-end role to your existing customer base, basically. And basically, to structure these four business models, what we see, obviously, there's different parts in the value chain where the telco might play. So we see the enabler role on the bottom with dedicated edge hosting and the edge IaaS, and more of an end-to-end role with systems integration and the end-to-end applications for consumers and businesses. Again, going back to our discussion around being a complementary party in the ecosystem, in these value chains, telcos can be complementary to existing cloud players, existing application providers, and for each of these business models, really. And in terms of the risk, I think that's quite interesting. Obviously, it's you see that with dedicated edge hosting and systems integration, you wouldn't have to do a rollout of edge compute across the whole network, across your whole geography. It's lower upfront risk in that regard. And I think for the edge IaaS as well as the end-to-end applications, there's a certain that might differ by use case, but there's obviously a certain critical mass of coverage that you need for some of these applications, and also to be attractive to developers and application providers. Coverage both in a sense of well, geographic coverage, really, but then also, and that's something I would like to discuss in a moment as well. It's about coverage with regards to the market overall. So you might only cover 30% of let's say the consumers in your market. So it will be critical to either onboard other operators in your market, your competitors, be onboarded by them, interoperate in some to some degree. And I know there's a lot of discussion around interoperability here in the edge compute space, but this is really then a key part as well for these more mass market applications to succeed. So based on this, what we thought about quite a lot over the last few months is then a bit more the practicalities and how should you go about approaching this. Definitely opportunity for telcos, as we saw with unique assets. And what we came up with is kind of simple timeline here, or a simple framework to think about how should you prioritize next steps, let's say for the next half year, and 6 to 9 months. So we think that it's quite critical to, first of all, bring all edge-related activities under one business initiative. This doesn't mean you're building one team for edge, but it means that there might already have been some proofs of concept in some parts of the organization, whether it's content related or more MEC related. And I think what we see is that there are a lot of people in telcos and different teams in telcos who have strong views on this as well. People who work on, let's say, the very early stages of figuring out what to do with 5G or with an SDN NFV deployment, they might have views, as well as people who work on next-gen consumer applications. So we think it's just critical to say, okay, let's bring people together in the organization and assess the current efforts that you have in your organization. What we've done as well with operators, and what's then kind of a first step, is to think about sort of anchor use cases. And these use cases could be based on very different business models, as we saw, but obviously there's not an obvious list of use cases for edge compute right now. So you need to figure out what's the right initial use cases that are realistic, where you might think about a potential customer already, really from this customer-centric and user-centric perspective. Right. Okay. We then think that it's critical to say, okay, who are the teams who drive this? And that might be different teams for the platform and then also for the products. But it's important to bring these people under this one business initiative, really, in the organization, and get them to own parts of this initiative. We also think that it's important, and this is not a technology push approach. This is really more of a demand pull approach, and think about the customer in the beginning. But we also think that it's obviously important to think about some of the generic platform requirements in the beginning. So based on your anchor use cases that you might want to identify, what's the kind of ideal scenario platform capability and the features that you might have on the platform.
And I think an important question you have to resolve here is, where do you see this? How do you see it operating? How do you see it being used by potential end customers? And what's their discovery method? What's their engagement model? So I think that's quite important when figuring out this platform. It comes back to this point about what are the rules and the policy engines, and how do they interplay. I just want to add to Jonas's point. The point of this all activities is that there'll be some from sort of fixed world enterprise side, there'll be some from the more mobile side, there'll be some from the IoT side. So you're going to find very disparate teams who potentially don't usually talk to each other, particularly the business teams. So the folks developing the business case from the product manager or marketing or the innovation teams, and you have to try and find some way of at least mapping all of their activities and seeing where have I got some commonality here. Where is is my edge, sort of all of my edge activities, what are they, and where can I start to look and think about these in a common way?
Right, and going back to the kind of platform requirements, there is one thing, obviously, what we've just discussed before. There is a degree of there can be several degrees of, let's say, openness of the platform, and as you heard from us, we advocate a high degree of openness, at least in the beginning, to kind of figure out what's going to work. Is it going to work that you're driving everything end to end, or are you enabling others? Are you enabling the cloud providers? So we think you should at least formulate an initial hypothesis of that openness. And then finally, also in this kind of bucket of short-term priorities, think about initial partners as well as initial customers, test these hypotheses with initial customers, test for interest, which then might be obviously interesting later on if you're running a trial with a customer and so on. And just, I mean, very briefly, in the mid to kind of long term, we think there's kind of two large pillars of things that and activities that need to happen. One is around operationalization. So following more of a customer-centric approach, let's say you should launch kind of a prototype platform, a minimum viable product or proposition. It's about defining these business models. So you saw the 4 different types before. So it's about figuring out what business model does work for what anchor use case, and then thinking about what could be a pricing structure for that, and who could drive the product. And then basically really hand this over to technical and commercial teams. In terms of this ongoing ecosystems dialogue, and this is nothing, it's not something that will solve itself overnight. So we think this is something you should focus on from the very beginning onwards. But then it's an ongoing dialogue that you need to have with other operators within your geography, but also globally, as well as then based on your hypothesis that you have in terms of how open do you want to be with the cloud players, you want to have a dialogue with these as well. That's basically this point here. And finally, it's also there's one thing which we see with cloud platforms and the hyperscale cloud platforms, and really the big success factor for these, one of the big success factors for these platforms is that they build up ecosystems of features, of APIs, access to APIs, applications that you can access easily on the platform, whether it's around, let's say, machine learning or analytics, as well as open source resources, and that might be as simple as database technologies and so on. So I think that's critical to then say, let's build up this ecosystem. There might be people who want to use your platform sort of as a marketplace really as well. You need to drive that. So that's kind of the our wrap up in terms of what your priorities should be, and tackling this and really using this realizing this opportunity. That's it so far in terms of our presentation content. We say thank you. And we also still have some time, I think, as well to answer some questions. So there is a chat box in the application, and you might just want to type your question into that, and we're very happy to discuss it now on the call.
Great. So I'll act as your moderator. Thanks, everyone, for listening. If you have any questions, as Jonas says, please do pass them in. We've got a couple to start you off with. So the first question ties to what the use cases are. And the question is a little bit particular in terms of the different strategies that are available to telcos that you talked about. Would you be able to tie any of the use cases to those particular strategies other than the edge hosting, which is obviously, the use cases are less relevant there.
Right. So I think if we start from the, so we had our 4 business models, and if we start from the business models, which are, let's say, end-to-end applications, we would, in that case, obviously think about consumer-centric applications first with, let's say, VR, AR, certain niches around gaming, for example, where latency matters really quite a lot. In the systems integration case, and systems integration here could be something which is, let's say, a very kind of one-off project, but it also could be something which is a bit more repeatable as a sort of B2B to X solution as well. Still kind of turnkey, but a bit more with off-the-shelf components. And that's obviously things around IoT analytics at the edge, what we see there quite a lot. We see there as well sort of between the more end-to-end applications as well as SI, depending on your business model with enterprise customers. we see use cases around VCPE emerging more and more. Obviously, we come from a UCPE world right now, and that's what's been gaining traction on the market. But obviously, the logical next step would also be to say there will be workloads at the edge of the network. I mean, and with regards to the edge, IaaS and PaaS, I mean, that's obviously also a very generic proposition. So that's like with any other cloud platform, you could imagine any use case on this really. So I wouldn't say that there's a specific use case tied to an edge IaaS. Phil, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, we get asked this a lot, of course, because I think you know, to build a business case, you want to try and see, well, what's the market, what are the applications, what are the use cases, and there are a whole class. I think there's a particular class that I would call around human experiential. So they're to do typically with augmented reality or virtual reality, where what you're having to do is capture quite a lot of information from the real world, process it in a way that it's not necessarily convenient to process on a device because of the battery, because of the amount of processing, because of additional information required to process it, but process it and reproduce it in a very real-time way. So if you're thinking about more immersive augmented reality experiences where you're getting an overlay of information, so you're looking at an object, a machine, or a place, and you want information relating to it to be overlaid. To do that effectively without carrying a lot of computing power and battery power is difficult. And those are obvious ones where, you know, if you want to use a lightweight, a Google Glass or a lightweight interface augmented reality, you kind of have to look at edge compute solutions to generate that sort of immersive overlay experience. So that's a whole class to do with human experiential, where we see opportunities in edge compute, and we see that a lot. And that extends to some augmented reality, extends to certain. I mean, gaming is a sort of very specialist case because of what gamers are looking to do. But so that's a whole class. And then there are some other classes that are more around localization, and yes, they have the same low latency requirement, but that's for very different reasons. And then I guess there's a class of low latency relating more to machines, to drones, to cars, to vehicles, to Industry 4.0, where the low latency is to do with a control loop. It's not to do with human experiential, but a control loop. And I think those are the main ones. There'll be others we haven't thought of, no one's thought of yet. There'll be ones that we're not aware of. There'll be some that'll have more to do with saving power than anything else, because you don't want a device running heavy workloads for whatever reason. Then we don't know what it is because, you know, we've not come across it yet. So there'll be some that are really driven more by power than experience, or by need for low latency for machine reasons. But these are the key groups of needs that we're seeing a potentially attractiveness of edge compute as a solution to address those needs.
Thank you. So I've got another question here, which I think really plays on STL's strengths as, you know, thinking about business model within the telco. So the question says, regarding what telcos should be doing over the next 6 to 9 months, and you say they should bring their edge initiatives into, you know, a single area, or have like a single view of what's going on, and own it in a single place. Do you mean just the product, or also the technical solution? Because the person asking the question thinks that if it's also the technical solution, that you can run into conflict with the network department in terms of how to deploy CapEx.
Right. I think what we meant there is really we think of this not as one place in the organization where the whole edge initiative would sit. We think of this as a business initiative which resides in several places in the organization. So the technical and platform part might reside in a different place in the organization than the product part, for example. But we think there needs to be some degree of coordination in the organization to bring these things together. So to avoid duplication inside the, I mean, it's as simple as that, but also to really capture the requirements that that a platform or the technological solution might need to meet. So I think that's what we mean by that. It's about maybe a very small team who's bringing things together in the organization, but obviously the owners of the platform, the owners of the product, still might reside then in different parts of the organization.
Yeah, I mean, we called it a business team, so it's the business owner, and in some organizations that could be a marketing function, it could be an innovation function, it could potentially reside within the CTO, but it's essentially someone trying to think and look out from a business perspective. You're absolutely right, the person who raised the question. This is going to create huge conflicts if you're suggesting that anybody in any lab or in any engineer in any function looking or working with edge compute needs to be reorganized under a whole new organizational structure. That's not what we're suggesting, to be clear.
Okay. So I think it would be great if you guys could quickly just touch a little bit on what are the key challenges that operators face, in terms of getting going here. I don't know, as a listener, it sounds to me a little bit like the use cases aren't super clear. So, don't wait and see, just go. But maybe you guys have some other ones to highlight as well.
Yeah, I think one key challenge is there isn't this huge existing demand just waiting, just queuing up. This is a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. That yeah, we know there are potential reasons to use edge, but if you go back to Jonas's chart, I mean, there are sort of solutions today based on devices and based on hyperscale that in their way address most of the existing applications today, and we're suggesting that there's something in between that could do some things better. We are also suggesting that you're not going to put all your workloads on the edge. If you're going to put the workloads that it makes sense for them to reside on the edge of your network, and the other workloads you're going to put them where it makes sense for them to be there. So you mustn't think of edge compute as a solution to an answer. It's part of the puzzle to a group of questions. And the problem I think operators have got is it's quite hard to identify demand. It's quite hard to identify how that's going to be monetized. And yet at the same time, these are investment decisions that are going to need to be taken quite soon, because they're in many cases they're associated with 5G deployments, and it's not something that operators can put off too long. They're going to have to figure out whether they want to get into this space and in what way pretty soon, because they're starting to roll out 5G networks and existing fixed line networks. And I think it isn't something. Yeah, you can play catch up, but you don't want to be catching up too hard and too fast. You want to be figuring out what you're doing sooner. So that's why I think the biggest challenge is resolving that business case problem. I can't point to demand. I can't go to analysts and pull out strong numbers for this figure. I don't think you'll find them very easily, because it's not an existing market that doesn't exist. So how can you size it today?
Okay. So I think we're running out of time, so we'll end here. And if we didn't have time to answer your question, then we'll get back to you by email afterwards. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you think of any questions afterwards, please do get in touch. And we will share the recording with everybody as soon as it's ready.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thanks, yes.
Thank you.